In the middle of a raging snowstorm, a little girl with only one leg struggles forward on her crutches, a loyal German shepherd by her side. Ahead of them, fire devours a pickup truck. In the truck bed, two men lie bound hand and foot, their mouths sealed with duct tape, helpless as the flames creep closer. One of them is Jack, a veteran who once saved the girl's life, the other, a young police officer. And unless help comes now, both will be lost to fire and snow. Before we dive into this unforgettable story of silent heroes, I'd love to know where you are watching from. Type your country in the comments, and if you believe no soul should ever be left behind, hit subscribe so you never miss the next story. Wishing you a peaceful good day wherever you are. The morning blizzard swept across Red Valley, Montana, turning the mountains and forests into a landscape of endless white. The wind howled, carrying with it sharp needles of snow that lashed against skin and blurred sightlines into nothing but haze. In that frozen silence, broken only by the moan of bending pines, a small figure trudged forward. Emily, 5 years old, her frail body leaning heavily on a pair of metal crutches, moved with painstaking steps. Her left leg ended at the knee, replaced by a polished prosthetic that gleamed faintly through the snow. Beside her bounded Rex, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat of black and tan, his powerful frame pushing against the gale with ears erect and nose pressed low. They had left the safety of the cabin behind because Jack, the man Emily trusted more than anyone, had not returned as promised. He was a veteran hardened by years of service, and to Emily he was more than a friend. He was the father figure who once pulled her back from despair. Rex halted suddenly, his nose twitching as if catching a bitter scent hidden in the storm. The dog let out a low growl, amber eyes narrowing against the gust. Emily tightened her grip on her crutches, sensing the change. She whispered his name, but Rex surged forward, dragging her attention toward a faint column of smoke twisting into the gray sky. They trudged downhill, the snow deepening around Emily's small frame, yet she pressed on, determination etched in her pale face. Through the curtain of flakes, a black shape emerged, half buried beneath frost and ice, a pickup truck, its cabin glowing faintly red. The smell of gasoline cut through the air, sharp and choking. Flames licked the edges of the seats, devouring fabric in hungry patches, and the fire crackled louder than the wind itself. Emily's wide eyes filled with fear. Something terrible waited inside. Her small hands gripped the cold metal side of the truck as she pulled herself closer. The window glass had already shattered, the cabin spitting smoke into the sky. But it was not the front seat that made her breath falter. It was the sight in the truck bed. There, under a dusting of snow and framed by curling black smoke, lay two figures. Jack, his broad shoulders unmistakable even when slumped, and beside him Ethan Cole, a 32-year-old police officer known in the valley for his youth and zeal, both bound cruelly with coarse rope. Their wrists were lashed tight behind their backs, their ankles tethered, and thick strips of gray duct tape pressed across their mouths. Their heads hung limply, chests rising shallowly as smoke wafted in. Emily froze, her heart pounding against her ribs as realization struck. They were trapped, helpless, and the fire was spreading. The snowstorm muffled the world, but Emily's cry broke through it. "Jack!" she screamed, her small voice cracked by cold and terror. The wind carried her call, and Rex leapt into action, claws scraping against the steel as he vaulted into the truck bed. He barked furiously, a deep booming sound that shattered the silence, his paws clawing at the ropes, his teeth snapping in rage. Sparks from the cabin drifted back, and the acrid stench of gasoline thickened. Emily struck the side of the truck with her crutch, desperate to stir any sign of life. The flames hissed as they climbed, orange light reflecting in the glossy eyes of the German shepherd. Inside, Jack stirred faintly, his lashes sticky with soot. He lifted his head with visible effort, his gaze hazy yet sharp enough to catch the trembling silhouette of the little girl he once saved. Their eyes met across smoke and snow, a plea and a promise. Rex lowered his muzzle and began to gnaw furiously at the rope binding Jack's wrists. His jaws worked with relentless strength, teeth grinding against the fibers, once, twice, again, each snap vibrating through the cold metal frame. Jack groaned behind the duct tape, his body twisting against the bonds. Emily clung to the edge of the truck bed, her prosthetic legs sinking into the snow, urging him silently not to give up. With a final jerk, the rope frayed and snapped under Rex's determined bite. Jack's arms flung forward, free at last, though the skin at his wrists was raw and bleeding. He ripped the duct tape from his mouth, the sound tearing through the storm, and gasped desperately for air thick with smoke. Jack turned instantly toward Ethan, whose body twitched as consciousness threatened to fade. Jack's fingers, stiff and trembling, pulled at the knots until they loosened. With the last strand undone, Ethan's hands fell forward, raw from the rope. Jack yanked the tape from his partner's face, Ethan coughing harshly as he inhaled his first unchoked breath. They exchanged a brief glance. No words were possible. But both knew what came next. The cabin roared, glass shattering as flames surged higher and the heat pushed against their backs. It was only seconds before the fire reached the fuel tank. Jack braced himself, grabbed Ethan by the arm, and nodded once toward the open air of the snow. With a grunt that tore his lungs, Jack slammed his shoulder against the tailgate. The frozen latch groaned before snapping loose, and snow poured into the truck bed as the heavy panel crashed down. The cold air rushed in, battling with the rising heat. Ethan stumbled to his feet, Jack right behind, and together they lunged outward. They tumbled into the snow, rolling as smoke and embers rained over them. Emily staggered back, shielding her face with her arms. Rex leapt free, landing heavily but upright, his fur singed at the edges. And then, with a sound like thunder tearing the earth apart, the truck exploded. The fuel tank ignited, a ball of flame engulfing steel and rubber, sending shards hurtling into the sky. The snow around them melted in an instant, blackened by soot, while the blaze raged against the blizzard. The ground shook with the impact. The shock wave rippling through Emily's small body as she fell into the snow. Jack crawled toward her, smoke clinging to his clothes, his chest heaving with every ragged breath. He reached her just as she tried to rise on her crutches, the metal frame trembling in her tiny hands. He swept her into his arms, holding her close as if the world might rip her away again. His voice cracked, roughened by smoke, trembling with gratitude and disbelief. "You and Rex, you saved me." His eyes burned not from soot alone, but from the surge of emotions too heavy to contain. Ethan collapsed nearby, coughing violently, the snow beneath him dotted with spatters of ash. He pressed a hand against his forehead, disbelief in his eyes as he stared at the wreckage of the truck. Rex circled the group, tail lowered but wagging weakly, ears flicking at every sound, his chest rising and falling with rapid breaths. His body bore the marks of his effort, singed fur, raw pads on his paws, and yet his eyes remained sharp, protective. Emily nestled against Jack's shoulder, her small fingers curling into the fabric of his sleeve. She whispered softly, her words barely audible over the fading roar of the fire. Jack tightened his embrace, whispering reassurance, though in his own heart he knew the truth. Without her courage and the dog's loyalty, there would have been no tomorrow. The flames continued to rage behind them, casting flickering shadows across the snow, a grim reminder of how close death had come. Jack's body trembled with both exhaustion and relief, his breath forming clouds in the cold air as he looked down at the fragile girl in his arms. His soul, scarred by war and solitude, felt a warmth he had long forgotten. Emily's face, pale but steadfast, lifted toward him with silent trust. In that fragile moment, amidst the ruins of fire and snow, a bond deeper than blood was reaffirmed, the bond of lives saved and faith unbroken. The wreckage of the burning truck still glowed behind them, flames clawing skyward as if to call every dark presence in the valley. Jack, Ethan, Emily, and Rex staggered away from the blast, snow swallowing the sound of their breath as they pushed deeper into the woods. The storm did not relent. Instead, the wind seemed to grow sharper, its roar folding into the creak of ancient trees, heavy with ice. Jack's chest burned with each inhale, the smoke from the explosion still lodged deep in his lungs, yet he pressed forward, one arm hooked under Ethan's shoulder, dragging him step by step into the white maze of the forest. Rex moved in front, paws crunching the powder, his body tense, ears swiveling at every sound, while Emily clutched her crutches, struggling but refusing to fall behind. For a time, Jack's strength held, his stature as a veteran evident even against the punishing cold. His hand gripped Ethan's jacket firmly, steadying the younger man's stagger. Ethan Cole, lean and dark-haired, his tan skin dulled by smoke and frost, let himself be guided, his boots slipping occasionally on ice. But as the forest thickened, Jack's movements slowed, his broad shoulders drooping, his breath shortening into ragged coughs. The older man stumbled once, then again, and finally dropped to one knee, snow spilling up around him. Ethan turned quickly, alarm lighting his tired eyes, and in that moment the roles shifted. He pulled Jack's arm over his own shoulders, muscles straining as he straightened under the older man's weight. Ethan's jaw tightened, his voice rough but determined. "I've got you now. We move together." Emily paused, her cheeks flushed red by wind, her hair tangled in frosty strands around her face. Her small hand brushed the snow as she reached to steady herself, and there her eyes caught a scrap of fabric half buried near a fallen branch. She bent down, lifted it, and shook away the snow. It was a scarf, navy blue, frayed and blackened by heat, but still visible was the faint stitching of the Helena Police Department insignia. Her lips parted in shock, her voice quivering. This came from one of you." Ethan glanced over, his brows furrowed, as Jack wheezed out a breathless curse. The discovery settled between them like a heavy stone, proof that the trap had been set not by strangers, but by someone with access to their world, someone who knew their patrols and trusted them enough to get close. Rex growled suddenly, the sound low and vibrating through his chest. He circled back, his nose close to the ground, before darting toward a patch of snow beneath a leaning pine. Ethan shifted Jack against a trunk, freeing his hands just in time to see the German shepherd clawing furiously at the surface. A length of wire, sharp and coiled, snapped into view. It was a snare, half buried, its cruel teeth waiting for an ankle. Emily gasped and stumbled back, her crutches nearly sliding from beneath her, while Rex barked once, sharply, as if to warn them all of the dangers woven into the forest itself. They pressed forward, but it was not the last trap. Twice more, Rex led them away from deadfall pits concealed under branches, once halting Ethan from stepping into a tangle of tripwire. The dog's instincts were the only reason they still moved freely, and each discovery tightened the knot of dread inside Jack's chest. This was no accident. It was a hunt. When they could walk no more, Ethan guided them into a shallow hollow at the base of a ridge. The slope shielded them from the worst of the wind, and the trees stood close enough to dim the firelight glow behind them. Jack leaned against the cold bark, his face pale beneath the stubble of his salt and pepper beard, his breaths shallow and uneven. Emily knelt beside him, her small body trembling not only from cold, but from fear that the man who had once saved her might not rise again. Ethan checked Jack's pulse with quick, steady fingers, his Marine training showing in the efficiency of each motion. "He'll hold," Ethan said quietly, more to calm Emily than from certainty. His own ribs ached, his head still spun from smoke, but he would not let weakness show. Not now. The silence settled heavy until Emily's small voice broke it. She looked from Ethan to Jack, her blue eyes shimmering. "Do you know why I came?" Ethan shook his head, puzzled. She pressed her lips together, then spoke, her words halting but clear. "A long time ago, my stepmother left me out in the snow. I was so small, and I thought I would die there. But Jack found me, and Rex. They pulled me back. They made me warm again. Since that day, he has been like a father to me." The confession fell, soft into the hollow, yet it carried the weight of a bond deeper than blood. Ethan's hardened expression softened, his gaze shifting from the frail child to the battered veteran resting against the tree. He understood then why she had braved the storm, why her crutches had not slowed her steps, because love stronger than fear had guided her here. Jack stirred faintly, as though Emily's words had pierced the fog of pain and exhaustion. His lips parted, and though his voice was hoarse, the faintest whisper emerged. "You're braver than me, little one." His eyes half opened, meeting hers, and for a moment the fire of gratitude flickered there. Emily smiled through tears, her small hand resting gently on his rough palm. Rex, as if sensing the emotion, pressed his massive head into Emily's shoulder, his warm fur against her cheek, offering the comfort words could not give. Ethan, watching this fragile circle, felt his own resolve harden. He had sworn to protect, and here was proof that some bonds, child, veteran, dog, were more sacred than any badge. The wind howled again, rattling branches above them, but the group huddled closer. Ethan tended Jack's breathing, Emily whispered soft reassurances, and Rex sat sentinel, his body between them and the unseen threats that prowled the white forest. The scarf Emily had found lay across Jack's knee, a dark reminder that betrayal had already struck once and might again. Yet in the glow of their shared warmth and fragile trust, the fire in their spirits held against the cold. Night did not come easily in the storm, for the sky was already dim, yet the forest seemed to grow darker, the shadows heavier. Still, within the hollow there was a sense of fragile reprieve. The flames that had threatened to consume them had been left behind, but the true fire, the one burning in their hearts, forged by loyalty, sacrifice, and bonds tested in snow, remained alive. The forest swallowed their tracks as snow thickened, muffling each step until even their breathing seemed too loud. The storm had not broken, but the shadows of late afternoon sank into the trees, the light draining until every trunk stood black against the white ground. Jack leaned heavily on Ethan's shoulder, his strength fading faster than his stubbornness would admit, and Emily pressed close to Rex, her small crutches planting rhythmic marks in the powder. When Ethan spotted the outline of a structure through the branches, a tilting roof, a sagging frame, he tightened his grip on Jack and pulled them all toward it. The cabin looked ancient, its wood weathered to gray, the shutters half hanging and the door leaning on rusted hinges. Yet, it was shelter, and in this wilderness, shelter meant survival. Inside the cabin, the air was stale, thick with dust and the faint musk of rodents long gone. Ethan lowered Jack carefully onto a broken cot and immediately began scanning the room. A small pile of split logs lay stacked against the far wall, brittle but usable. Shelves sagged beneath rusted cans and a cracked lantern, and a hearth lined with blackened stone waited cold and empty. Ethan knelt by the fireplace, his fingers stiff with cold as he worked the kindling, striking match after match until a thin flame caught and grew, snapping to life against the dry wood. Orange light filled the space, casting shadows across the warped planks, and for the first time since the explosion, warmth returned to their hands and faces. Jack exhaled a groan, his eyes squeezed shut, while Emily sat nearby, her prosthetic leg stretched awkwardly, watching Ethan with wide, anxious eyes. Rex lay at Jack's side, but his heavy breathing drew Emily's attention. She touched his paw gently and gasped to see blood darkening the fur. A shard of glass from the truck must have lodged near his pad, and though the cut was shallow, it still bled steadily. Emily hurried outside, scooping snow into her mittens, then pressed the cold pack carefully against Rex's wound. The dog's ears twitched, but he stayed still, his gaze fixed on her face, as if understanding the tenderness behind her trembling hands. "You're going to be okay," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. Jack, through the haze of pain, managed a faint smile at the sight, the veteran's weathered face softening as he whispered, "Good girl. He trusts you." Ethan turned back to Jack, his jaw set as he tore strips from his undershirt and improvised bandages. His Marine training steadied his hands, and though the materials were crude, he made them count, binding Jack's thigh where a deep gash had torn muscle. "It'll hold," he muttered, pressing down firmly. Jack grunted but offered no complaint, only a nod that spoke more of endurance than comfort. The firelight danced against the lines of exhaustion etched into Ethan's face, making him appear older than his 32 years, but his eyes carried an unwavering clarity. He worked with quiet focus until Jack's breathing steadied and some color returned to his cheeks. The weight of responsibility pressed on Ethan, yet he bore it with the resolve of one who had seen combat before. As the night deepened, the wind hammered against the cabin walls, rattling the loose shutters like skeletal fingers. The small group huddled close, their shadows swaying with the fire's flicker. Then, without warning, Rex rose to his feet. His ears twitched, his head lifted, and after sniffing the air, he slipped silently through the door. Emily called softly, but Jack raised a weary hand. "Let him go. He knows what he's doing." The storm howled outside, the minutes stretched, and Emily's eyelids drooped with worry until the door creaked open again. Rex returned, his coat flecked with snow, his jaws gripping a half-burned duffel bag. He dragged it to the hearth, dropped it with a grunt, and stepped back. Ethan unzipped it, and his eyes widened at what lay inside, a charred but intact medical kit salvaged from the wreck. Gauze, antiseptic, burn cream, even antibiotics, treasures in the frozen wilderness. Relief swept through them. Ethan cleaned Jack's wound properly, applying ointment and clean bandages, while Emily rubbed balm gently onto Rex's paw, her small hands steady now. Jack leaned back against the cot, exhaling a breath of gratitude. He reached to rest his hand briefly on Rex's head. "Still saving us, aren't you?" he murmured. The dog lowered himself to the floor, curling at the threshold of the door, his massive frame blocking the draft, his ears flicking at every sound. Emily, at last comforted, climbed onto the cot beside Jack. Her small body leaned into his side, her head resting against his chest as she drifted into sleep. The fire's warmth and the rhythm of Jack's heartbeat lulled her into dreams, while Rex remained a silent sentinel, his amber eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. The cabin seemed secure, but Jack's instincts would not rest. His years in service had taught him that danger did not always knock loudly. He shifted against the cot, eyes narrowing at a faint glint outside the window. At first, he thought it was frost, but then the sound came, the soft whine of machinery followed by a thud in the snow. Jack forced himself up, ignoring the protest of his muscles, and limped toward the door. Outside, half buried in the drifts, lay a small black shape with shattered blades and a cracked lens. A drone. Its frame still hummed faintly, the light blinking in uneven spasms. Jack crouched, picking it up with stiff fingers. The snow clung to its body, but the insignia etched into its side was unmistakable. Military grade, not civilian. His blood ran colder than the air around him. When Ethan joined him, flashlight in hand, Jack turned the device over. "They're watching us," he said flatly. The drone had fallen, but the fact it was here at all meant they had been marked, followed even into the wilderness. Emily stirred awake at the tension in their voices, rubbing her eyes as she asked softly, "What is it?" Jack didn't answer directly. Instead, his jaw tightened as he spoke the name that chilled him more than the snowstorm. "Creighton," the word dropped into the cabin like a curse. He had known the man once, a decorated officer, older, tall, with silver streaks in his beard and the coldest eyes Jack had ever seen. Creighton had vanished from public record after corruption charges evaporated suspiciously, but whispers of his new empire had lingered. A trafficking ring built on fear and betrayal, spreading like rot beneath the surface of law. If the drone was his, then they had no more time. The fire popped loudly in the silence that followed. Ethan's face hardened, his dark eyes narrowing as he processed the revelation. Emily clutched her crutch tighter, pressing herself closer to Jack, her breath quickening. Rex growled low from the doorway, his gaze fixed outward into the storm as if he could sense the unseen predators waiting beyond the tree line. Jack looked at each of them in turn. Ethan, steady but weary. Emily, fragile yet unyielding. Rex, faithful and unbroken, and knew that the cabin's walls, no matter how strong the fire burned within, would not protect them for long. "We leave at first light," he said hoarsely, voice carrying the weight of finality. "If Creighton's eyes are on us, staying means dying." And as the storm raged outside, their fragile sanctuary became only a pause before the next fight. The storm still raged through the trees, rattling branches and driving waves of snow into their path, but the fire inside the abandoned cabin had already gone cold. Jack, Ethan, Emily, and Rex pushed deeper into the forest, moving with urgency born of the discovery of the drone. Jack's limp grew heavier, his breath clouding in painful bursts, while Ethan's hand clutched the makeshift bandages around his ribs. Emily stumbled in the snow, her metal prosthetic clicking softly against her crutch, her small figure dwarfed by the vast and merciless wilderness. Rex stayed ahead, the sable coat of his 6-year-old frame flecked with frost, his body taut with restless energy. Then the sound came. Too heavy for the wind, too deliberate for wildlife. Boots breaking through snow from all sides. Jack's eyes narrowed, and Ethan raised his head sharply. They weren't alone anymore. Shadows moved between the trees, black shapes sliding through the blizzard with precision. The men emerged gradually, rifles slung, masks pulled tight against the storm, their formation practiced and confident. They were not wanderers, but hunters, hardened mercenaries with eyes that glimmered cold behind their goggles. At least half a dozen circled them, weapons ready but not yet firing, as though savoring the trap. Jack pulled Emily behind him, one hand gripping her small shoulder while the other clutched a broken branch like a weapon. Ethan stood at his side, his posture rigid despite exhaustion, his dark eyes locked on the encroaching ring. He recognized the discipline of the men, the way they moved, military-trained, efficient, merciless. His heart sank as he whispered, "Creighton's dogs." The circle closed tighter, and Emily trembled against Jack's side. Her cheeks glistened with tears that froze almost instantly, her blue eyes brimming as she clutched Jack's calloused hand. "Don't make me leave," she pleaded, her small voice breaking through the roar of the storm. Jack's chest tightened at her words, torn between the instinct to shield her and the knowledge that there was nowhere left to run. Ethan gave a sharp shake of his head as if to snap him back into focus. "If they take us alive, it's worse," he muttered. Jack nodded grimly, but before he could answer, Rex growled deep in his throat, the sound rumbling like thunder. His amber eyes flared with fire, his stance rigid, hackles raised. In the next instant, the German shepherd exploded into motion. Rex lunged straight at the nearest mercenary, his massive frame colliding with the man's chest in a flurry of snarls and snow. The rifle went flying, the soldier crashing into the drifts as Rex's teeth clamped onto his arm. The circle faltered, the momentary chaos ripping their formation apart. "Move!" Ethan barked, shoving Jack toward a gap while he himself charged another man, grappling for control of the weapon. Emily screamed as another mercenary lunged for her, but Rex spun free with blood streaking his muzzle, throwing himself between the girl and the threat. The dog's body slammed into the soldier's legs, sending him sprawling backward as Emily stumbled into Jack's arms. The path was opening, but every heartbeat carried the risk of it slamming shut again. Jack's strength flickered, his injured leg refusing to carry him far, but adrenaline surged as he dragged Emily through the snow. Ethan fought like a man who had nothing left to lose, each strike brutal and efficient. He knocked one man cold with the butt of a stolen rifle, only to be tackled by another, rolling through the drifts in a spray of frost. A blade flashed in the stormlight, slashing across his shoulder, and Ethan roared in pain as he twisted free, slamming his elbow into the attacker's jaw. Jack tried to turn back, but another mercenary bore down on him, swinging a stock like a club. Jack barely lifted his branch in time, the wood shattering under the blow. He staggered, fell to one knee, and only Emily's terrified cry snapped his focus back. Rex tore across the snow again, his teeth latching onto the mercenary's leg, dragging him down in a spray of white. The battle became a blur of desperate motion, grunts, shouts, gunmetal clashing with the fury of survival. Ethan was bleeding heavily now, his shoulder slick with crimson, but he stood his ground, firing short bursts from a captured rifle into the storm, forcing the mercenaries to scatter behind trees. Jack pulled Emily close, his own chest heaving, every muscle screaming under the strain. They had survived fire and traps, but here, in the frozen dark, they were cornered by predators who knew their craft. Emily clung to him, sobbing quietly, refusing to let go even when he urged her to crawl away. Her refusal burned into him like a brand. She would not abandon him, not after all he had done for her. Jack's heart swelled with both dread and pride. In a moment of fleeting clarity amid the chaos, Jack spotted the torn strip of reflective fabric still clinging to his ruined jacket. An idea, born of desperation and soldier's instinct, flickered in his mind. He tore it free with trembling hands, his breath shallow as he scanned the trees. If rescue was anywhere near, they needed a signal, something to cut through the storm. He lashed the strip to a high branch, raising it above the snow as best his weakened arms would allow. The wind caught it immediately, glinting faintly even through the blizzard's haze. "Now," he rasped. He looked down at Rex, who had limped back, his chest heaving, blood darkening the snow beneath his paw. "Give them something to follow, boy." Rex obeyed without hesitation. He raised his head and barked, 3 sharp rhythmic bursts that cracked through the storm like gunfire, then paused, then 3 again. The cadence echoed across the valley, a pattern drilled in training years ago, an SOS that no soldier would mistake. His voice rolled through the forest, carrying farther than any shout could, a call not only for help but for hope. The mercenaries faltered, glancing at one another in unease, for even they recognized the signal that defied silence. Ethan braced his rifle, Jack clutched Emily tighter, and together they endured the storm, their last stand marked by a strip of torn cloth and the unyielding bark of a dog who refused to let them vanish. The clash ebbed gradually as the mercenaries pulled back, not in retreat, but in cautious recalculation, wary of the possibility that their prey had summoned greater hunters. The forest quieted again, though the snow still fell thick, blotting out sightlines and muffling sound. Jack collapsed against a tree, his arms wrapped around Emily, while Ethan slumped into the drifts, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Rex dragged himself back to the doorway of their makeshift refuge, his body trembling but his head held high, ears alert, guarding them still. In the distance, the echo of his signal bark lingered, carried by the wind into the unknown. It was fragile, uncertain, but it was a chance, and in the white silence of the Montana woods, a chance was everything. The echoes of Rex's rhythmic bark still lingered in the forest air, carried by the storm until it faded into silence. For a time, only the creak of trees under the weight of ice and the labored breaths of Jack, Ethan, and Emily filled the night. Then, faint at first but growing steadily louder, came the thrum of rotor blades slicing the sky. A pale light shimmered through the snow, sweeping over the treetops, cutting beams into the dark. Jack raised his head, his eyes narrowing against the glare, hope flickering in their tired depths. Emily gasped, clutching his sleeve as the shape of a rescue helicopter loomed above the canopy. Against all odds, their signal had reached the outside world. The helicopter descended into a clearing with a roar, rotor wash flattening branches and scattering snow like a wave of white dust. Men and women in rescue gear spilled out, dressed in thick orange jackets marked with insignias, their expressions sharp and urgent. Leading them was Captain Sarah Lorne, a woman in her early 40s, tall and lean, her face wind-burned and lined by years of command in unforgiving wilderness. A jagged scar traced her chin, a reminder of failures past, but her dark eyes gleamed with resolve. She shouted orders over the roar, her voice carrying a certainty that cut through chaos. Within moments, the team spread across the clearing, rifles at the ready, medics with kits rushing toward the wounded. Jack's body sagged in relief, though his instincts never fully rested. He had lived long enough to know salvation sometimes came disguised. But when he saw the insignia of Montana Search and Rescue, he allowed himself to believe. Ethan collapsed into the arms of two medics, his uniform dark with blood. His jaw clenched in silent defiance as they began to work, his body trembling with shock, but his eyes never lost their focus. "Don't waste your effort on me," he muttered, grimacing through pain. "Make sure they take Creighton. Make sure he answers." The words came not from bitterness but from a vow, his voice steady even as his strength drained away. Sarah knelt beside him, her scar catching the firelight from their flares, and nodded once with steel in her gaze. "He'll face justice, and you'll live to testify." Ethan allowed himself a faint, weary smile before closing his eyes, surrendering to the hands that patched and stabilized him. His survival was not just for himself, it was the final weapon against the predator who had haunted them. Behind them, the mercenaries who had fled into the woods were dragged back one by one, bound and disarmed. The strike team moved like a tide, efficient and unyielding, until even Creighton himself was forced to his knees. Age had silvered his beard, but not softened the cruelty in his gray eyes. He sneered even with blood at his lip, his voice dripping contempt. "You should have stayed buried, Jack. The world doesn't care for ghosts." Jack, leaning heavily on his crutch, met the man's stare with cold silence. He needed no words. The sight of chains binding Creighton's wrists and the confiscated folders stuffed with ledgers, photos, and names spoke louder than anything he might say. It was over. The trafficking network would not hide in shadows anymore. Emily sat wrapped in a silver rescue blanket, its crinkle loud in the quiet that followed. The warmth of it barely touched her, but the steady rhythm of Jack's heartbeat as she leaned into his chest did. She pressed her cheek against his worn jacket, eyes heavy with exhaustion, but full of trust. To her, he was no longer just the man who had once found her in the snow. He was her anchor, her protector, the father she had prayed for but never thought she would have. Jack tightened his arm around her small shoulders, his throat aching as he realized how much she had risked for him. Through all the smoke and blood, she had never let him fall, and now, in the quiet after the storm, he swore never to let her feel abandoned again. Rex lay on the ground nearby, his paw bound hastily with gauze, his chest rising unevenly. A medic crouched over him, whispering softly while checking for broken bones. Despite the pain, Rex's tail thumped against the snow, weak but steady, as though assuring everyone he was still here. When Sarah stepped forward, carrying a small bronze medal shaped like a paw print, the men and women gathered fell briefly silent. She knelt beside the wounded dog, clipped the medal gently to his makeshift bandage, and spoke clearly enough for all to hear. For loyalty beyond fear, for courage beyond instinct, Rex, honorary K9. The German shepherd wagged his tail harder, his amber eyes meeting Emily's with quiet pride. Even bleeding, even weary, he stood taller in that moment than any soldier could. The rescue team worked swiftly, loading the prisoners into one transport and the survivors into another. Ethan was secured with IV lines, still conscious but fading into fever dreams, yet his lips continued to move, whispering vows of testimony. Jack helped Emily into the chopper, then turned back for Rex, lifting the heavy dog into his arms despite his own injuries. For the first time in years, Jack's heart ached with something other than loss. He felt the weight of responsibility, of new beginnings, and he welcomed it. The rotors whirred above them, snow blasted sideways, and the helicopter lifted into the storm, carrying them away from the forest that had nearly swallowed them whole. Days later, in Helena, the trial began. The files taken from Creighton's camp painted the full picture. Routes, names, profits scrawled in numbers that turned human lives into currency. The courtroom was heavy with silence as Ethan, pale and bandaged, raised his hand to swear the oath. His voice, though strained, carried conviction as he detailed the night, the betrayal, the traps. Creighton sat shackled, his sneer dimmed but not erased, and for the first time, the weight of justice pressed down upon him. Outside the courthouse, snow fell quietly, but inside, truth broke through like sunlight after weeks of storm. Later that evening, Emily sat curled in Jack's lap, her head resting peacefully against him. Papers were signed, official words spoken, but none of that mattered as much as the quiet promise Jack whispered into her hair. "You're mine now, kiddo, and I'm yours. No one will take that away." Emily smiled, her small hand gripping his calloused fingers, her voice muffled against his chest. "I knew you'd say that." Rex lay at their feet, his leg bound but healing, his ears flicking in contentment as he drifted into sleep. For the first time in years, Jack allowed himself to believe in tomorrow. They gathered the next day for a modest ceremony on the courthouse steps. Snow dusted the crowd of officers, neighbors, and strangers who had come to witness. Jack stood tall, Emily at his side, wrapped in a new coat, Rex wearing his medal proudly. There were no speeches of grandeur, no banners, only the quiet applause of people who understood. Jack looked down at Emily, then at Rex, and finally out at the faces before him. "Heroes don't always wear uniforms," he said simply. "Sometimes they're broken soldiers, little girls who refuse to give up, or dogs who never stop fighting for us. But they remind us of what's worth saving." His voice carried not through microphones, but through hearts. And when Rex barked once, sharp and proud, it felt like a vow. In the end, this story reminds us that true heroism is not always loud or celebrated. Sometimes it lives in quiet sacrifice, in the compassion of those who choose to protect others, even when no one is watching. Jack's endurance, Emily's courage, and Rex's loyalty show us that kindness and selfless love can shine even in the darkest storms. Take a moment to reflect on what silent acts of love have touched your life. Share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to the channel so you will never miss a story of courage and hope, and may God bless you and your loved ones.